City University Television presents the American Theater Wing Seminars. Working in the theater. This seminar, playwright, director, choreographer.
Welcome to the American Theater Wing's Working in the Theater Seminars, now in their 27th year, coming to you from the new Graduate Center of the City University of New York. These seminars provide a wonderful opportunity to learn from the panelists the realities of working in the theater. Today's seminar is devoted to playwrights, directors, and choreographers. We will learn something about how they became professionals, their work ethic, and their reasons for remaining and working in the theater. I'm Isabel Stevenson, Chairman of the Board of the American Theater Wing. I think you will enjoy and learn from today's experience. But now, let me introduce our moderators for this seminar. First, a distinguished member of the theatrical community and Chairman of the Board of the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center, George White, and Pia Lindstrom, theater critic and TV personality. Thank you very much, Pia and George.
Thank you, Isabel. I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists on the far right. Again, not a political statement here. David Esbjornson, who has been artistic director of the Classic Stage Company and is currently represented on Broadway with the production of Ride Down Mount Morgan. On my immediate right, Lynne Taylor-Corbett, who claims that her understandably proudest achievement is her son Sean Taylor-Corbett, but has also choreographed the Titanic and is the director and choreographer of Swing.
And next to me we have David Leveaux, who is represented by The Real Thing on Broadway. He's a heavyweight director, having done many other things, which we will discuss. Next to him is playwright Becky Mode, whose first play, Fully Committed, is a smash hit. You want to know how she did it. And next to her, Richard Nelson, who has got The Dead, James Joyce's The Dead, is on Broadway right now. He's also honorary associate artist of the Royal Shakespeare Company. And I want to know how a guy from Rhinebeck, New York, got to be in the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Well, about 14 years ago, the Royal Shakespeare Company did a play of mine called Principia Scriptoriae. Not a very good title, but they did it. And it went fantastically well. And the week after it opened, they asked to commission a play. And I wrote a play for them called Some Americans Abroad. Then the week after that opened, they asked to commission a play, and on and on and on it went, until over about a 13-year period, they did 9 plays of mine. And by that time, I think they figured they had to give me some kind of title. And I became an honorary associate artist of the RSC. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing because it's for someone who doesn't live there, someone who isn't English, to be sort of embraced and given a home like I was is truly remarkable.
Well, now you've adapted, which is something I wanted to, I think, start with. This wonderful production going on now on Broadway of The Dead. And you've also directed it and adapted it and done the lyrics. And there has been a lot of talk about whether playwrights should direct their own work. And of course, this is sort of your own work, but it's also James Joyce. Would you perhaps give us a little insight on what you do when you adapt as opposed to write? Something from scratch, as it were.
Right. Well, and I also made the coffee every morning for the actors.
I forgot that. You're absolutely right.
Well, the adaptation of Joyce was hard, but this particular piece came out of 2 things. One, my wanting to write or try to create what I would call a Chekhovian musical, something that was seemingly contradictory. something that would be a musical based on a small incident, a small gesture. And at the same time, I wanted to work with this amazing composer, Sean Davey, who is Irish, lives in Dublin. And so the idea of, when you start to think about the subject, the idea of Joyce comes to mind, obviously, when you're thinking of Ireland and Sean. And the dead, part of the Dubliners, was the perfect sort of adaptation for this concept of this Chekhovian musical. So the adaptation was really quite simple. I tried to keep as much of the Joyce as I could. I tried to embrace the Joyce as much as I could. I tried to frame it in a different way because it was a play and not an adaptation. Trying to find those things that make it a play. I mean, just a tiny little difference. In the short story, there's a great revelation, there's a great moment where the main female character remembers something. And this happens at the end of the story, really, almost towards the very end. And in the adaptation, we put this much earlier, so that there could be an evolution of drama, just a dramatic event through the story. So trying to bring something into a sort of a theatrical context was the journey, and one that at the end of the day we kept on saying, are we being faithful to Joyce? Would Mr. Joyce roll over in his grave or just accept this? And hopefully he's okay. He hasn't appeared as a ghost yet.
The two Davids are, in fact, doing plays of living playwrights. Now, that must present a problem. You can't exactly start futzing with the... What do you do?
It's another kind
with
of...
Arthur Miller when he comes and says, that's not what I had in mind.
Well, it's been a remarkable experience, and I'm so struck, and may sound a little silly, but I'm so struck by his youthfulness, by his fearless sense of experimentation. It actually was really wonderful to work with him on this project because he encouraged all sorts of expression and interpretation. And obviously the playwright is the primary artistic expression, the play itself, and that's what we all take our inspiration from that. But when that happened, then he gave back something, and he began to respond to what we were bringing to the table, and it becomes a lovely kind of dance, where you respond to the play and the playwright responds back, and you end up creating something that's quite unique, a synthesis of those two expressions.
How did Tom Stafford?
Well, Tom, I mean, it's interesting listening to Richard, because I think there's a clear distinction in my mind between those writers who have a practical and active experience of the theatre, and those writers who write for the theatre who choose to be much more private and not be directly engaged in the process of production. There are advantages for a director in both of those things at different times, but and Tom Stoppard is certainly somebody who wants to be involved very closely in that process, but not in a way that intervenes. He's extremely graceful in that way. I was thinking, just leaving Tom aside for the moment, that the closest experience I've had with a living playwright is with Harold Pinter, the British writer Pinter. And this got so close on one occasion that I actually ended up directing him in his own play, No Man's Land, where I made a kind of contract with him at the outset, which was that he had to come to the rehearsal as an actor. And then on Friday evenings we could have a drink and he could be the writer, which he was very happy to do. For those of you who don't know Harold Pinter, one of the things he's very famous for is being really very, very rigorous and severe about the accuracy with which his text is delivered. In fact, this is simply because it's written so well, and it is true that if you deviate from it, then you can feel a quantum loss of energy. But I do recall going into his dressing room one evening during the run of No Man's Land to give him a note, because I felt that he was coming in on a particular line rather too quickly, and this was causing a moment of really incomprehension in the narrative for the audience. So I, of course, brought this to his attention, as you would, as the director of an actor, and said, no, actually, you can't do that. You must. We really need the space there. So, and he said to me, initially he bridled rather. He said, look, look, I think we found, as we're playing it in with the audience, we found that actually we need to move it on there. And I said, well, actually, that's not really the experience of sitting out there where I am, Harold. He said, well, I mean, it feels just more comfortable to get on with it there. And finally, I sort of feel this was going to be rather a tense exchange. He said, look, I think I have to tell you, not only do I think this is a pause, but I think you need a silence, And this point I had an inspiration, which was, of course, to pick up the script. And I was hoping, against hope, that this was going to be borne out. And I got to the moment, and indeed, he had written silence. And I could put it, and I said, there you are, you see. And there was this silence that followed this. And he then said to everyone else in the dressing room, because they were all showing dressing in this small theatre in London, he said, what the director is telling me here is when the writer wrote silence, he knew what he was doing. And I shall observe that.
That's great. Becky, what's your take on this? Now, you, of course, there's a lot of things I want to ask you. I'm just bubbling over with things. Your first play got on, basically. And how did you do that? And tell us about the collaboration with you didn't direct your own work.
No.
I
mean, I was thinking my collaboration was with the director, but also with the actor, because we developed it together. So I would take my cues from him, and that most of the time, when something wasn't working, when it wasn't sounding right to me, it was generally my fault. Something that I had written wasn't working. So that was a real education to me, and we had a wonderful director. So, I learned a lot from both of them. How my first play got on is a mystery to me. I can't answer
you
that.
didn't throw it up over a transom. They don't have transoms anymore.
But you took it from your own life. You were a
coat check girl and a waitress, and
this is good preparation for writing.
Yeah, it's good material. And I guess the only thing I can say is the desire not to be a coat check girl and a waitress was a strong motivating force. And also just working for a long time, workshopping it, working with the director and the actor, doing readings, getting feedback.
Well, let's back up before the coat check girl, because you didn't just decide to write a play, did you? I mean, you must have been trained, or
I was trained as an actor.
Okay.
I wasn't a very good actor. I was telling you beforehand.
As I said, why didn't she star in her own play if she's an actress?
I wasn't good enough, and I was lazy. It takes a lot of work to do what this actor does. So I guess sort of as an observer, I was around writers and directors and actors and the theatrical process for a long time, but never as a writer. And then, after stopping acting, I floundered around and I did theater criticism and I did various other things and sort of stumbled upon writing, really.
And then submitted, again, how did this start?
How did it come to be?
I'm thinking of people in the audience that want to have written a play or want to write a play, and here you are as Exhibit A of having had
I guess in our particular case, one step in the journey was that I developed it, just working with the actor. We started off in my living room and with improvs and putting a tape recorder on, and then I would sort of listen to it and transcribe it and develop it and make a story out of it, develop the characters. As far as how we got from here to there, at one point there was an article about the actor in the newspaper saying sort of reservationist takes his last call because he got a job as an understudy for Rent. And it was all about what life in this dank reservation office. And in the article it said, and he's working on a one-person show, and from the article a producer called us, and that sort of lit a fire under me. We were sort of in the vague phase. There were sort of pages here and pages there, and he was like, well, I'd like to look at the text. And I was like, oh, there is no text. So it sort of motivated me to do things faster than I might have, and that was a stroke of luck. But really, the main thing I would say is the first reading was in my apartment, in my living room with 10 people, and then we got somebody to lend us the theater and invited more people, and just kept working at it, truly, for 3 years, and listening to what people had to say, and taking the first one, which was about 2 hours and 15 minutes, to make it 1 hour and 15 minutes, and deciding that if 10 people told you this part was boring or this part didn't work, that there must be something to it, and just keep trying to make it better.
Lynne, you're a choreographer as well as a director.
Yes, correct.
And it seems as though the line between the two is blurring these days.
I think so. I think I've been fortunate enough to direct, you know, in regional theater, and that's been fantastic because it's something I've always wanted to do. My father was a writer, so I've always been attracted to serious material, and in my commissions I usually deal with serious subject matter, but when I'm hired as a choreographer, often I'm hired onto projects that are, you know, more joyful and more like pure entertainment. So it's really fantastic to bring both, I guess, both sets of skills into one project. And it's interesting listening to the writers and the directors because we started with a word, swing, and just had no script or outline even, really, initially. And just the thought that it was a state of mind, not a time, that it wasn't just about the 30s and 40s, that it was our American expression in terms of our American music and folk dance, because it all arose out of youth culture and it has re-arisen out of youth culture. And so it was kind of a process, you know, such as you had, I think, really a trial and error. We had 3 workshops. We, you know, gathered the old favorite songs that you say cannot do a show without these, and of course half of them fell away. Then I was so lucky to have Ann Hampton Calloway and Everett Bradley and Casey, you know, to write new material so that you lay the old and the new side by side and you say, what is it about this that vibrates in us as a people? I found that in working on it, that the joy that it brings is as deep as, you know, quote, serious material. It's sort of a different kind of material than I've ever been involved with. And as Richard said, you know, trying to be true to, you know, was I true to swing? I found that we could be true to the spirit of swing, and we had to amplify quite a lot of the forms to fit into the theater, because they're generally forms that are done in a small competition area or in that kind of arena. Mm-hmm. So we finally made, I said, I just want it to be an event that tumbles off the stage and hits you and you never know what's going to happen next. And that in itself was a sort of strange authorship that involved many, many people and a lot of collaboration, but, you know, ultimately was just the most remarkable experience I've had in the theater.
Well, now you're a kid. I mean, I know about swing. And where did you go for your research?
Well, first I have to say that I grew up, I have 5 sisters, I have a huge family. We grew up in Denver, and in the car we would sing those songs, because my dad, you know, sang them from, I guess, the war, and, you know, so we would go along, you know, shrieking out at the top of our lungs, I'll be seeing you, and, you know, all the tears flowing and so forth. So we were a pretty passionate bunch. But then I really did a lot of research. Paul Kelly originated the idea, and Paul brought it to the Frankel organization, and there had been a lot of research collected. And then I just, you know, I went to competitions, I reviewed competitions, I read all the big band books, and I just tried to put myself in that state of mind, which is really a special place to be. And it was just a lot of meeting the gurus of the different forms of the dances, and the new forms and the old forms, and you know, really traveling all over the country. I felt I was a Charles Corral to swing for a while, and I had a wonderful time, and, you know, just feel I grew a lot as a person in terms of the need to collaborate with so many people too, because it's like speaking 14 languages. You just can't do it 1, 2, 3. You have to give over and pull people in, and I had a great team.
It seems like dance is becoming more gymnastic on the stage. I mean, people are doing incredible things. Is this coming from all that aerobic training that people have been doing?
Strange, I know, it is a bit of a trend. I mean, well, of course, the original swing dancers were unbelievable. I mean, if you look at the old movies, they just were fearless. And but I do think there has been an introduction of different forms into the Broadway culture. You know, partly, I mean, river dance, and you know, bringing back all the Fosse.
Savion Glover.
Savion, yeah, exactly. So I think what it is diversity. It's you know, more of a world culture, and I think what's fantastic about it is that we are experiencing and seeing things, you know, virtuosities that we have not experienced in the Broadway theater. So I think in a funny way, it's the Broadway theater that's diversifying and allowing all of this great new stuff in.
Yeah, it seems quite different than the old-fashioned.
Yes.
I want to know, when did we begin talking about director, choreographer, and choreographer, director? That's only recently that that kind of billing has come about. And how did that start? And who has, not the upper hand, but who has the last direction between the director and choreographer? What is the difference? And how does it work?
I think that's also a very good point, Isabel, because you not only have a director choreography, but you have someone like a Julie Taymor, who is a puppeteer and a director. And all those lines are beginning to... anyone want to...
I believe the first... I think I know this, the answer to that. I think the first choreographer who also directed was Agnes DeMille in Rodgers and Hammerstein's Allegro.
I think you're right.
In '47. So that began, and she was the one who really started to do that more and more. So in the '50s, obviously, became a much more...
Jerry Robbins, Bob Fosse, Michael Bennett.
I would think, I would guess that the division is depends on the kind of piece it is. If it's a strong, big dance piece, I know that in the musical that I did, The Dead, I worked very closely with the choreographer, wonderful choreographer Sean Curran. But everything was about character. Everything. If you saw the piece, it's just a little story of a party, really, and everything was about what one of these people could do. And they were taught steps, but they were taught steps as if they were part of that society. What steps would these characters have known, and then let free them? There was a certain part, there's a little moment towards the end where 5 men come in, and they've prepared something for this woman who's dying, and they sort of sing and they make some movements, and we tried many, many different things to do, until what we did finally is just sent the 5 guys out into the hallway and said, you've got 10 minutes, come back with what you do. And that's exactly what we put in, because that was the real situation. So I assume it's really just depends on what kind of piece.
I agree. I think there are, you know, works that require a huge amount of musical numbers and also a huge amount of book scenes. And I think, you know, sometimes 2 people together can be a fantastic team, and other times it's a type of piece where it just sort of flows from the same source more easily. And I think it just depends on the situation and the willingness of people to share their talents and try to see the same picture. I mean, you can't project it on the wall out of your head, but you know, the communication is just so delicate and so important and has to happen. I've done, you know, sometimes I love being the choreographer, and other times I love being, you know, the person in the whole driver's seat. I think both have their own joys.
Is this the first time that you've done the both?
It's the first time in the Broadway arena. I've been fortunate enough in the regional theaters.
And before that, it was either directing or choreography? Or what?
For myself, I came up more as a choreographer, a commissioned choreographer in the concert.
Were you a dancer? Had you studied movement?
Yes, I was a dancer. I was the only white member of the Alvin Ailey Company when I was a kid, and I had a very strange, circuitous path. I danced on Broadway in several shows, including I was the floating Cassie in Chorus Line for a while. I always knew that I had to be on the other side, though. I was, you know, if I came out the stage door and someone approached me, I would look behind to see who was behind me. I couldn't conceive of myself as that person, so I knew I was meant to be, you know, behind the scenes.
But you do traditional ballet as well, American Ballet
Yes, I
Theater,
do.
and so
Yeah.
it's not just Broadway.
I find it's just a privilege to move back and forth because, you know, that's a pure empty slate, it all comes out of your own head, and then when you have a text or, you know, trying to find the characters, and a lot of the work I do now in my commissions is character-driven, but it's just a different kind of challenge, and I think the variety is so, we're so privileged to have the opportunity to have
How did
variety.
you train?
First ballet, little church basement with my mom playing the piano, and then later on, better and better teachers, and came to New York at 17, went to SAB, realized that Colleen Leary was this thin, and I could see myself on either side of her. I better go elsewhere, and I did. I got away that summer, and found my way to Harkness House, and Alvin Ailey saw me, and it was just really wonderful. Unexpected. I didn't have, any sort of training about what you're meant to do. I didn't go to university or anything, so I sort of blew my own self sideways for a while, and happily landed in a profession that I truly love.
But I think that's one of the things that these seminars do is to show the various paths that people have taken to come to where they are at the particular time that they're on the seminar. And also the value of having done all these things so that you know the other person's role. If you have to direct or if you have to stage manager or whatever you have to do to know what it is, so to have that crossover of experience. I think it's one of the most important things to bring to the theater, and it's so necessary.
I've always wondered how directors, and some of you seem very polite and very pleasant, how you deal with the enormous egos of some of the performers you have to deal with, and how do you keep them in line? I mean, you describe who. You've dealt with some of the important.
I suppose. Yes.
You seem so mild-mannered.
I've dealt with some egos, I suppose. I don't know. I mean, egos come in different forms. I mean, in the main, I think you have to start from the premise that actors or performers of any nature are in an incredibly exposed situation, and therefore, more exposed than sometimes it's
highly vulnerable.
It's possible to imagine. It's very, very vulnerable, and it's very, very frightening. And without crossing the line between directing and therapy, which is a line that I hold to very rigorously, I would say that unless you start from that premise that you are dealing with somebody who is enormously gifted, who lives their life, their working life, at a level of intensity and vulnerability that is very difficult to match elsewhere, that then you have to filter what it is that you're receiving from them through that particular thought, through that medium. There are, of course, occasions when, in any group of people, there are influences or pressures on that group or on the work that may seem to be inappropriate, that could potentially be destructive. And I think it is very important to be able to establish with a group of people what the, as far as you can, what the shared objective of this event is, what the, if you like, the grammar that we're all working with here is. And then you must say, if somebody is departing from that or is in some way distorting it without actually transforming it into something useful, you must call them on it.
And you should do it early.
And you should do it early. Yeah. But I don't necessarily think it's not something that necessarily is always has to be done in a kind of a poisonous.
No.
There's
It's sort of anticipating it before it becomes a real problem.
yes, if you're lucky.
Yeah.
Well, let's name names. Patrick Stewart is an enormous performer.
Yes.
Well, how did he not just run away with a play? And did you have to hold him back? And
Well, I think with Patrick, it really started out as a partnership. I went out to California and met him. I didn't know him. And we talked about the play for 6 hours straight in his backyard. And I don't think he intended to do it when I went out there. But by the time we finished the conversation, we realized that we had a connection about the material and that we were both very excited by the prospect of working together. And it's on that basis that we continue to, work on this play. And I think that if that hadn't been the case, we just wouldn't have gotten anywhere. I mean, Patrick is an incredible actor in the sense that he has wonderful charisma, but he's also extremely hardworking, and he's very serious. And if the challenges are there and you're prepared to meet the challenges with him, there's not a problem. He's absolutely game for anything, and he's fearless.
How much were you informed by his other work? In other words, when you were out there?
Well, actually, the other work is more of a problem because
that's what I mean.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, because people tend to think of him as Captain Picard, and
exactly.
His image is based on that. And I think what I needed to know from him is whether he would be willing to get down and dirty in this part, because it's a part that it really asks that you're not liked. I mean, you have to be prepared not to be liked on occasion, and it's a bigamist, and it goes against a lot of people's morality. And I was really struck by the fact that he was brave enough to take that on, and he was not interested in maintaining that image of the Star Trek.
Did you? Were you the one that gave him the toupee?
We
break that image?
We talked about that.
I mean, seriously, because that,
Yeah, we talked about that, and I think, I can't remember if it was he or I that brought it up first, but might have even been the costume designer. But we did want to present an image that was different from what people expected.
Indeed.
Yeah.
What gave you the background or the ability to deal with these two strong legendary figures, both in the acting and in the playwriting? You have Arthur Miller and Patrick Stewart, and you're a very young person. Were you not
that young?
Fairly young, I would say. Not intimidated by this?
Oh, I mean, I still pinch myself that that my Broadway debut is with Arthur Miller and taking a new play of Arthur Miller's to Broadway. I think that it really comes down to everybody wants to be respected in this business, and everyone wants to feel as though what they contribute is important. And when there is mutual respect within a group of people, in the way that I think there is between Arthur and Patrick and myself, I think a lot can be accomplished. A lot of wonderful things begin to happen. You were talking about, actors and vulnerability. And if you've ever been on the stage, you know that there's nothing more terrifying than not knowing what you're specifically doing. It feels like you're a car on ice and you're just skating off and you're going to crash. So I think that the best thing that you can do as a director is to bring a very specific and detailed approach to the work, and to make sure that the moment-to-moment actions of the play are clear to the performer, and that you are articulating what the author intended. And if that begins to happen, people start to relax and trust. And
were you an actor?
In an amateur capacity.
How about you, David?
Yeah, and I was very briefly a very, very, very bad actor. Actually, my greatest contribution to the British theatre was giving up acting. But having said that, I'm, from selfish reasons, very grateful that I did that.
Yeah,
because,
me too.
I actually think you probably, as a director, learn more from being a bad actor than you do from being a good actor, because if you're a very good actor, you don't necessarily know how it is that you do things, but if you're a very bad actor, first of all, in the main, you get to work with, equally bad directors,
right.
and which sort of, tends to increase the chances of that experience that you're talking about, being on stage and not knowing what you are doing. I mean, if I could tell you, that's something that haunts me, but I keep at the back of my mind, and I don't usually actually tell companies that I work with this, but here I am actually, mentioning it on TV, but I'll tell it anyway. One of my early acting jobs was to play all the messenger parts in King Lear, which incidentally taught me that if I ever directed King Lear, and we had a very short rehearsal period, I would direct the messenger, because King Lear can look after himself. He's got several goes, to get work. Messenger, being a messenger is, pinpoint precise. You can't. And there is one message that you have to deliver in King Lear, which is mysterious, and I can only think that Shakespeare may have intended it to do to an actor at the time in his company what it did to me, which was that you come onto the stage and you say to Cordelia, "Madame, the Duke of Cornwall's forces approach with all." And she says, "We know of this before." Now, the problem I found, which haunted me for the full 6 weeks of this run, was how to then leave the stage. And it was, you know, it was a production, it was a Shakespeare production where messengers tended to come on and kneel. I mean, it's not something that the Royal Shakespeare Company does anymore, and certainly since I've directed Shakespeare with the RSC, we didn't, and partly for this reason, we had no kneeling of messengers. Because to get up from the kneeling position after you have run allegedly 25 miles to deliver a message which Cordelia has already heard, the thing I found just instinctively happening to me was a kind of shrug. We know of this before. Well, and I spent 6 weeks trying to suppress a shrug. And this exit became enormous to me. I mean, you know, looking back on it, it's hilarious, but there's also, you know, a basic truth about an event like that, which is that, you know, as David is saying, the absolute responsibility to reach a point with your company whereby every actor on that stage is connected into the narrative, has a sense of purpose, knows why they've come on, and how on earth they get off, is really, you know, the bare bones of this job before one even gets into areas of mystery or truth.
Staging and stylized.
Yes, that fundamentally, that's, you know, you must do that. And I just recall so vividly what that was like. And I shall never forget it, and I'm glad I haven't.
Were you an actor, Richard?
No, thank God. Thank
How
God.
did you begin? What is your background?
Well, I'm a playwright. I started writing plays when I was 15, and wrote between the age of 15 and 25, maybe 20 plays, most of which I did myself in various ways, college and whatnot. And started 25 years ago this year, had my first professional production in Los Angeles. And all the plays up to then I had directed, but at that point I stopped directing completely. And then about 3 years ago, Adrian Noble, at the head of the Royal Shakespeare Company, they had commissioned a children's play from me and from a friend named Colin Chambers. And we wrote this play called Kenneth's First Play, and someone else was going to direct it, and that person pulled out a month before. Adrian said, "Will you do it?" And I said, And I made him swear that he would come to a run-through in the rehearsal room. And in all my years working at the RSC, no artistic director had ever come to a run-through in the rehearsal room. And he did, and I found that I enjoyed it again. And he came to see it, and he, bless him, just said, at the end of it, he stood up, looked at me and said, "See, I told you it was easy," and left. And that sort of lit a fire, but mostly for me, the training has been very simple. I spent 20-some years sitting next to, close to, behind, around some of the greatest directors of the English-speaking world, just one after another. People from Trevor Nunn to Liviu Chule to David Jones or Roger Michel or John Madden. I mean, extraordinary group, a number of people, Peter Gill, an amazing range of directors, and I learned from each, and was in awe of each, and enjoyed each. And it's come a time in my own writing that I've learned that I've now put what I want to see on the stage and how it works are so entwined that I feel that maybe I'm the best person to, or the easiest person to convey that, relay that, and organize it. So it's a big, big change for me in my life in the last few years to come to that conclusion. And changed everything, changed your personal life, because I love the life of a writer. There's nothing greater than, I have a nice desk and a stream, and I pick up my kids from school, and now suddenly I'm eating in restaurants and watching late night TV.
Well, and you've also done something else which I'd like to get in a little bit. You've also collaborated with other writers and particularly on Misha's party, you work with Alexander Gelman, who speaks no English. And I don't think your Russian is fluent.
No,
I wanted, how did you do that?
Well, Alexander Gelman is one of the truly great playwrights of then the Soviet Union when I started to work with him in Russia. And we were, through a long process, we were commissioned to write a play together from scratch by both Royal Shakespeare Company and the Moscow Art Theatre. And it would be done in both places, and it ended up being done. And so we started, I met in Moscow, and then we worked through an interpreter. And our biggest chunk of time was working was the MacDowell colony, bless it, was just incredible. They brought us to the MacDowell colony, gave us a cabin in the woods, rooms to stay in, fed us, left a little basket on our front porch for lunch. And we had this amazing interpreter, translator. And at about 6 o'clock, we'd break out the vodka and start to work the evenings. And I remember one time we were, I speak no Russian, none. I don't know the alphabet, I don't know anything. So we're talking through this translator, and one of the characters' name is Mary, and I was saying this, and Sasha was saying in Russian, and the translator's back and forth, and finally the translator says to me, well, what if Mary does so-and-so? And I thought, it's not a very good idea, but it's not a terrible idea. I said, okay, Mary could do so-and-so. And the translator comes back, speaks, and comes back and says, Sasha says he doesn't like that. Says, why should Mary do so-and-so? I said, I thought it was his idea. And the translator says, no, that was my idea. so I don't know who wrote the play. I don't know how it evolved.
Very funny.
And so we have this. So this play happened in this. It was a slightly more organized process. What happened is we agreed on the story and the characters on a very tight scenario. That's what we involved. We didn't try to write the dialogue together. Mm-hmm. Then I took that away, and then I wrote the scenes. I wrote the dialogue, which I then read to him through an interpreter back in Moscow. And then he gave me his notes, and then we agreed at that time to part, meaning he then took my play, and then he adapted it. And changed even the location, made some significant changes in it. So there's sort of two different plays, slightly different plays or whatever, one in Russian and one in English. And it was done at the Royal Shakespeare Company, where it ran for its typical 2 months in rep, and it's at the Moscow Art Theatre, where it's been running 6 years.
Oh,
so,
great. My goodness, very exciting.
Becky, what is your next play?
I don't know. My latest production was a baby. So
okay.
I had a baby 4 weeks ago. So I haven't been thinking of much else.
Well, that's a production. That's fair.
It's a production. I have an idea, a germ of an idea for a play, but I haven't even gone to, there's sort of a step I'd like to take of immersing myself in the world, and I haven't even done that. But I figure I have to start sleeping 5-hour stretches before I can do any of it.
Did you study? Did you go to a school to learn playwriting or read any books? Is there some advice you could give all the people who might like to do what you did?
As I say, only just again by soaking up as an actor. I was in a theater company in Boston. I struggled for a while here. I went to the American Repertory Theater as an acting student. So I've, by observation, basically.
So there's no text that one could purchase,
I defer to Richard. I don't know.
Manual on what's the
write a lot, and see a lot. That would be the thing. I've done a lot of. I made a very conscious decision when I was in my late 20s to try to involve myself both in classical theater and also to adapt, translate classical plays, and I've done a lot of that. It's lucrative, and two, it also teaches you a lot of the form of theater. It's very significant to do. I think one of the dangers that exists now from the time when I was a young playwright is people do think that there are books. When I grew up, I think that people didn't think there were books. So what you have is a lot of advice now, a lot more advice than my advice was, I will do it, I will don't do it. And that was what I got. This is like, let's do a reading, and then let's all talk about it. And let's do another reading, and let's all talk about it. Let's do maybe a little workshop. We're not really investing in the audience. We don't really know if they're responding in a real way or in a workshop. And then let's talk about it. And I think that by and large, more plays are lost that way than made that way. But that's my my
What do you?
I agree. I think that I've had I was directing something at the Directors Circle, and I was part of that, watching that process for a while. And there was some wonderful work. And it just seems that what happens when it passes through so many hands and so much processes is that whatever was the passion that was that original piece can, it just, go so circuitously through the hands of so many people, and oftentimes in those various workshops it changes directors, and a lot of what I said to the author I was working with, I would love to see your original script, because what made you write this? I'm not getting where the passion is, and I went back to a much earlier draft and worked from there. But I think it's partly the economics of someone who isn't established, and luckily, you were able to get your plays produced before all of this new kind of economy in the theater, and so it's difficult. I know for the young choreographers, for the young writers, I think it's a much harder world. And when people ask me, "Oh, how did you do such and such?" I say, "It's a different world. I can't give you advice based on this, because I'm now at this age, having already had some sort of a profile." And it's difficult to start now.
I was just going to say, for me, it's probably a different level, but the workshop process for me was valuable. I mean, I know it can sort of fold in on itself, but it wasn't always valuable, but I felt, again, over time, if I got the same message from people that I trusted, it helped me.
I just think it's a problem when it becomes playwriting by committee.
Yes.
That's where the danger is. But I think there's such a responsibility as a director in helping a play to arrive, because I think there's often a tendency to want to make something like what you already know, rather than listening to the specifics of that material or that voice. And I think that's the most important thing that you can do as a director, is encourage both yourself and the actors to listen to the writer and to hear the rhythms and the nuances and the subject and even the structure of the piece, because that's when you actually get something very unique. You discover something unique, and you don't turn it into what everybody already knows.
Well, now you moved the play from the public theater to Broadway. What happened to it textually from the public of Ride Down Mount Morgan to Broadway? A lot, not a lot?
Oh, well, I think the majority of that kind of movement was done at the public. I think the physical vocabulary for the play was arrived at there. So, there were rewrites that happened as a result of going to Broadway, but I think most of it was directorial interpretation. Arthur did write a speech for the end of the play, which Patrick actually took on and read in one of the previews. And we began to feel that was right. And then once that was established, we cut we removed the ending of the play that we had created down at the public, because now we felt like the play should end in a different spot. So I think the thing that struck me, in terms of this idea of listening to a play, is that Arthur had written a play that was very abstract and nonlinear, and the character would go into fantasy, would go into memory, anything to escape his present situation of being discovered as a bigamist with two wives on either side of him in a hospital room. So what I began to discover is that there are conventions to plays, and we would set up a convention of there would be a convention set up in the writing, but then I began to discover that when the character got into trouble, he would break the convention of the play in order to escape his situation, and it began to be a lot of fun to think about. Okay, well, we can do this, and now we can just bag that. He no longer has to he no longer has to be in a hospital bed. Now he can get up and run around. Then and it just went on like that, and as it felt like a liberation to me, and it felt like a discovery. And I felt like I began to understand what he had always had in mind. And so I think that there's, I think with that in place, then whatever rewrites came into the process were appropriate to that initial vision that Arthur had always had, but that we had to wait around for us to discover.
To follow up on George's question, did you have to enlarge the play? Did you have to open it up more when you came to Broadway? Also, why did you want to come to Broadway for the play?
Well, the main thing I think about coming to Broadway is that I feel like Arthur Miller and Broadway are synonymous. I feel like the play has finally found its audience, and that it is an audience that loves and respects this writer. And it's so wonderful to be in the theater and to see that happening. It's really extraordinary. And as far as moving the play, we didn't have to do a tremendous amount of changes to the physical production because the space was pretty close to what it was down at the Public. But it has more height in the Ambassador Theater, which gives it a little bit more air and breadth. And we also wanted to just sharpen things up, make sure that our ideas that we initially created for the public were just taken to the next level. And I think we were able to do that. Things are quieter, they move quickly, edges are sharper.
Do the performances have to be larger?
We try not to do that. We try. I think it's it can be a kind of a disease for a big theater where everything gets so big there's no nuance left, and so we try not to do that. The Ambassador is actually a nice space because it allows a kind of intimacy for it. But I think what we discovered as we went uptown is that we found more humor in it. You know, I think Beckett said, "There's nothing funnier than unhappiness," and we were able to deepen the play and consequently find more comedy in it.
When you say do it louder, I was thinking of the mics that are now used in almost all Broadway plays. How do you writers and directors feel about that?
It's a terribly difficult question, this, because I come from a theatre culture where the idea of voice reinforcement is met with horror, because there is a kind of almost sort of Puritan ethic about the fact that it is up to the actor to project and to be clear. I think, though, you have to take into account levels of expectation when you're, say, moving a play from one culture into another. You must take into account, there's no point hanging on to some principle for its own sake if ultimately it's not delivering the experience of the play to an audience. I have to say that I think this is, sometimes people say that this is due to the fact that the modern actor is less equipped to project than they were 20 years ago. I think this is only marginally true. It's not that, it's just actually our expectation of volume is actually different. We are accustomed to that compressed, intensified sound that comes out of the television, the
movie
the
theater.
Walkman, the CD.
You don't have to reach for it anymore. You don't have to work. It just comes at you.
It comes at you, so that it's an essentially passive process, where I think, 20, 30 years ago, it probably was a much more active process in audiences. But I also think, we're living in noisier cities. The fact is that most of the theatres in London were, of course, built at the time when the noisiest thing that would go past would be, a horse and a carriage, which could be noisy. Well, now, we have fire trucks, we have ambulances, we have, our police who got those nice sirens from over here and installed them over there. And there is a sort of, in other words, silence has more or less been privatized now. It's not widely available. And you have to find a way of overcoming that. I think that when David said about trying to find a way in which one can maintain nuance and a level of reality in the acting when you go into a bigger house is so important, because it's very easy to become anxious and say, no, we're suddenly in a big house, nothing is true anymore. It's absolutely true, but you have to negotiate somewhere. You have to negotiate. Actors are going to have to speak up. They're going to have to fill spaces that they didn't have to fill before. And to be honest, I think sometimes that can also reveal other things about the play,
Right.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very exciting too. It's not the idea that whispered, allegedly psychological naturalism somehow is true and anything louder is not true is fundamentally not, doesn't seem to me to be the case in the theatre. In the theatre, you have all sorts of levels at which the truth is spoken.
Give me an example of negotiate. How,
Yeah.
what you're saying.
Okay. Sometimes it's a question of rhythm. For instance, I mean, in my case, Tom Stoppard's play The Real Thing actually started life in this production in a small space, very small space in London, the Donmar Warehouse. Now, in the Donmar, it is possible to move faster. It's a very small space, a very intimate space. In other words, an actor can speak at the speed of thought, and nothing is lost. As you get onto the bigger space, if you speak at that speed, it is literally not, it doesn't arrive with an audience. They don't get it.
Gets garbled.
Yes. So, in fact, what we had to do was slow some things down. And, the play takes a little bit longer. I remember Adrian Noble, actually, the RSC, telling me when I was working there that there was a line rate in Shakespeare in the smaller space, the Swan Theatre, which is entirely different from the line rate in the big house. That I think it was something like 14 lines per minute in the Swan, and 11 to 12 in the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, the big theatre. And this was just timed by Terry Hands over a whole season. It's in those areas where you almost have to get used to what feels artificial to begin with, but don't lose faith.
Right.
Know that when you come through...
But some of it is also energy, taking the energy through to the line, articulating, just basic things of speaking, for the stage. And that buys you a lot. You can... But we talk about it as there's a certain point in the rehearsal process, it's usually in one of the previews, early on, where the audience isn't quite getting what they need from the stage. It almost always happens because you come out of the rehearsal room, which is intimate, and now you have to be in the space, and that adjustment is very delicate. And so we talk about sharing the play with the audience, and I think it's a good way of discussing it.
Could I ask you to hold that thought and share it with us when we come back?
Sure.
Because you're going to stop for just a minute here, and everybody's going to stretch and rest and do whatever they have to do very quickly, and come right back, and we'll continue with the American Theatre Wing seminar.
Very interesting. Now that explains.
This is CUNY TV, Channel 75.
Welcome back to the American Theatre Wing seminar on working in the theatre. Before we return to our gifted panelists, I would like to remind you that the Wing is more than a sponsor of seminars and more than our famous Tony Award. The award is presented for excellence in the theatre, as many of you know. The Wing is an organization whose year-round programs are dedicated to serving the theatre and the community. And since one of our goals is developing new audiences for the theatre, we have created meaningful programs for students like Introduction to Broadway, which began 8 years ago and has enabled more than 80,000 New York City high school students to attend a Broadway show, many for the very first time. And through our Theatre in School program, professionals like these in our seminar panelists that you see today go directly into classrooms to work with and talk to students about working in the theatre. In addition, we have a hospital program which dates back to World War II when we operated our legendary stage door canteens. Today's version of the program brings talent from Broadway, off-Broadway, and the cabaret world to entertain patients in hospitals, senior day and nursing facilities, aid centers and child care facilities in the New York area, bringing the magic of theater to those who are unable to get out to enjoy the theater themselves. We are proud of the work we do and delighted with the wonderful working relationship we have with the theatrical community. We are grateful to our members and everyone who makes possible all the American Theater Wing does. And so having said that, let's get back to our seminar on the playwright, director, choreographer. I'd like to start part two with a question myself, and I'd like to start it with David, if you may. David Leveaux, that David. Do you rely on workshops in the English theater as much as we tend to here in New York?
Probably not to quite that extent, no. Although we have a fairly thriving workshop culture, and there are, attached, for instance, to our Royal National Theatre is a studio which is dedicated to the development of work and in a workshop situation. I think that what Richard had to say about how sometimes the idea of the endless workshops diffusing the original energy of a play or a piece of work is a very genuine danger. And I think it comes from a sort of misplaced notion of refinement, a word that I particularly hate, which you don't hear so much in the theatre, you hear it more, I think, in the movies, is the word polish. I hate this word because because what it conjures up is the notion that somehow you can sort of burnish off the sort of awkward corners and edges of this thing until it actually becomes acceptable in a sort of rather homogenized fashion. In reality, we're all of us about making a piece of live theatre, and to make there is only one test that I ever think of applying to that, which is simply, is it living or is it not living? Sometimes something that is very gawky, apparently badly structured, has got all sorts of built-in contradictions and moments when the machinery creaks, it can make the most fantastic theatre, and that if you attempt to soften or refine or to polish, very often what is vital and energetic about the piece just flows out of it, and it becomes a rather sort of bland exercise. And I just think on that score, from a directing point of view, because when I began directing, I was so desperate for every production to be terribly good that inevitably one tried to sort of smooth over any of the difficult moments, either by making it simply go faster or introducing some startling lighting effect, or if the worst came to the worst, a piece of music that people could leave the theatre. People could leave the theatre humming, And it took me some years, really, to discover suddenly that no, when you meet a moment in a play where this seems to contradict this, and it's a very awkward corner that we've all got to get round. But rather than trying to, as it were, shave off the edges until they became the same thing, it was actually much more energetic and exciting to extend the space so that the contradiction became larger. And as it becomes larger, very often you find in that place, in that awkward turn in the play, that energy literally floods in to the scene, and you may find something that is coming from some very deep place in the play that starts to reveal that play. As David said, because you used the word revelation, that is a very proper use for a workshop, is to reveal a play. I think a dreadful use for a workshop is to refine it so that you can get it past the critic of the New York Times. It's a disastrous idea. It will never work.
I think the other thing, just to expand on that idea, is that sometimes you can only go but so far without some production around you, because that is a layer of a play that is vital. I mean, in our real lives, we have stuff around us, and there is a design, and there's a choice made, and that part of a collaboration takes something further. You can't just say, imagine, if you will, a living room. You know, eventually you have to take the chance of saying, I have a vision for it, or my collaborators have a vision for it, and we must be there in order for this to reach its fullest potential. And I think for myself, workshop was incredible. We were speaking about it, you know, that because there wasn't a script and because we were inventing vignettes, we needed a lot of time, and we never ever showed the work in a linear fashion. It was very, I think, disturbing to my producers at times, because we had to show, okay, here's something that's developing, and here's something, and eventually those two islands will connect. That it's not a comforting thing to hear, you know, for a producer. But God loved them. They hung in there, and so that was very, very helpful. But I don't think that we could have continued much further than, you know, having to be shoved onto the stage, because literally we had the opportunity, and then it took a huge leap, and that was very important.
I think there's a question of what a workshop is for. I've worked at the studio at the Royal National Theatre doing a workshop that was very, very useful. But no one from the theatre ever saw what we did. It was only for us, and that was a very useful thing, only for us, to get people together to try to sort something out. It's a problem in a workshop or a reading or anything like that. It has an element of judgment over it. Right. That you are doing this workshop to see if something works, and therefore see if you can go the next step. That's a big problem, and it's a very confusing one for a playwright. What will happen is, because people can't separate what they see in a reading or a workshop from the work itself. Right. So if you have Meryl Streep, who plays the maid in your reading, and she'll never play it in the production. She does the reading. After the end of the reading, people say, "Oh, the maid was fantastic." and then you have another reading in 2 months, and you don't have Meryl Streep, and people say, "What'd you do to the maid? How did you work that up? I remember it so much more vividly." And you can get incredibly confused. You can move this way and that way. As a playwright, I've had many different productions of the same play, and so you can see how different directors have taken things, sometimes when you've worked with them, and sometimes when you've just gone to an opening night. And it's amazing. Elements of a play that are a real big problem, where a director is like almost has his hands around your throat as a playwright, saying, cut it, change it, whatever. In another production, no problem at all. And to learn that, learn what is your center and what your place is, as opposed to going left and right and being bounced around. It's the hardest.
Well, and readings become commercials in a way, and so there's a pressure to present them in a way that will get producers interested in actually going to the next step. And that isn't a very useful investigation, if that's what you're doing.
Although it can be, you can add a certain level of excitement to the moment, can't it? Which is sort of, I mean,
That's what I won't rehearse readings because of that. You know, it has to be raw, because I don't want people to misunderstand.
Explain that.
Just go in there the day of and tell people what you want and talk about the character a little bit and let it fly, you know.
And you don't have formalized readings?
Well, it's formalized. I mean, it would be in front of an audience. But what I'm saying is rehearsal is deadly with a reading, because you take you take those first impulses, and then you talk about them and deal with them and take them to the next step, and you're not ready to do that. And so sometimes it can kill a play.
Well, there's a point where the rehearsal or a reading demands that you either do it for 8 hours of rehearsal, just so you know where it is.
Right.
And once you're beyond that, then you're into 3 to 4 weeks.
Right. You're into
because you can't
whole other
explore
arena.
deep enough, and you're just skating on the end, and then it gets confusing and crazy, I think. I mean,
And the playwright director, who has the last word, who makes the decision when you're one?
You know, I like to make decisions with a playwright. I don't feel like it's ever useful to work at cross purposes. But I think that there's a kind of an adage of the theater, which is that the playwright conceives the play. Arthur said he hears the play as he writes it, and then he's lucky if he ever hears it again.
That's great.
But then at a certain point, the playwright gives that play over to the people that are going to interpret it, and I think at that point it becomes the directors. And then there's another point at which you the director, deliver it, and sort of and give birth to it, and it becomes the relationship of the actor and the audience. And so I think that there are stages of responsibility. But I don't think you ever want to, it's not that delineated. You always want to refer back, you always want the author's opinion in the process. You want the actor's opinion early on as well, you know.
I always, if I'm directing my own play, on the first day I tell the actors that I'm going to do what I think every director I've ever worked with has secretly wanted to do, and that's throw the playwright out of the room. And I start that, and then it becomes very useful, because during rehearsal, if there's a certain time where someone wants to change something, I'll say, I'll just have to go consult with the writer. I'll maybe walk a few steps and say, no.
What happens when you're the playwright and the director? How do you get yourself out of the room?
Well, I just throw myself out. I mean, they're confused by that point as well.
See, I love having the author in the room because when the author talks and sometimes reads the play, I mean, not too often anymore, but just the stories that they tell, the way they speak, those are all really strong indications of how the play should.
Do you find that having a playwright read the play out loud, and sometimes I have, is very instructive, both as a director and to the other actors as they do with the actors?
Yeah,
do you find
I do. I think to a certain point. I mean, otherwise it becomes intimidating to the performer. But the other thing is just the stories that they tell, what interests them, where their politics lie, and like I said, the rhythms of their own speech, which I think actors pick up on. They absorb that, and you can get pretty close to the material that way, very quickly.
I'm going to interrupt this once more as we have questions from our audience, and so we can come forward and with the first question, please.
Hi, my name is Margot Evan Goldman. I'm an actor, and this question is directed to David Leveaux and to Richard Nelson. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The question is, can you describe the differences between American and British audiences?
Richard. I think that the biggest difference, I think the most important thing is the difference between British and American theaters. And people will say, oh, there's a certain kind of training, oh, there's a certain kind of whatever. I would say that the difference is simply product. That in a theater like the Royal Shakespeare Company, they're going to do something like 30 productions a year. And the at the Royal National, another 30 productions a year. That's 60 productions of classical work in some way. It's just simply, that's so much. And I think that breeds an audience, a knowledgeable audience, of a kind of theater-going audience who has seen X, Y, and Z. And I think that's basically different. There is more product. There is more to see. There is more classical work being done.
I think it's, we were just talking about this back there before we came out here. There is clearly I think there's an increasing divide between particularly what you might call old school producers here believe. For instance, the New York audience will take or not take to. That in fact there is an audience here which I think is simply sensational in the sense that it is open, flexible, has a way of coming to the theatre and from the word go is prepared to accept whatever comes off that stage. You have maybe about 2 minutes before they can start to become disappointed or whatever, but from the word go. Last year we brought a production of the Sophocles' Electra into New York with Zoe Wanamaker, and I didn't really think about this play coming into New York at all. In fact, I was particularly keen. It started life in London, and I was very keen that it didn't come to New York as some sort of horribly shiny British import of a classic. I mean, who needs it? It sort of had the kiss of death to it. So what we did was we went to Princeton, to the Mercator Theatre there, because Zoe and I wanted to work on the play again, and we recast it, and we had a fantastic American company. And then there was the sort of necessary heat to move it, you know, roughly into New York. But what was a very interesting thing was the amount of advice I got before this actually happened from producers here, one of whom, who shall remain nameless, said to me, "David, you have to understand that the New York audience don't like Greek choruses." Where is the evidence, you know, for that? Of course they do if it works. Of course they do. So I think, you know, but what Richard says is true. You know, in London it is a very highly literate audience. I don't think the audience here is illiterate, but we is an audience which actually tends to go to plays sort of rather in the way they have meals. And therefore, you know, they can have a great time, it's really enjoyable, and say, not bad, you know, and then leave. There's no, you know, not bad, that's great, that's fine, okay, we'll do it tomorrow, you know. So sometimes you sort of feel yourself, if you die in the theatre in England, it's death by indifference. And here it's death by fire. And, you know, it's up to you. And I think the latter is more energetic. If, you know.
Is the laughter come at different spots with the American audiences and to the English audiences?
I think it does. But I don't think there's any science for that. I think it does. I think that some things that, for instance, in an English play like The Real Thing, written by, well, really actually by a Czech masquerading as an Englishman, Tom Stoppard, you know, there are some things that the English just take for granted, which perhaps seem more sort of people can't sometimes quite
like
believe.
Like the cricket bat.
Right, cricket, yes. And sometimes here you can feel an audience not quite being able to believe anybody would say what they have just said. You know, and there's an excitement about that.
That's great.
Come to think of it, that would probably be so about off-Broadway audiences and Broadway audiences as well. Is that so?
Becky?
Is there a difference, or California and Chicago and New York?
I don't know. I mean, one of my experiences with just taking our play from place to place is we went upstate to the Adirondacks, and people told us, well, it's a very New York play, and people won't get it in the Adirondacks. And,
or in Rhinebeck.
In Rhinebeck. And it was a different type of audience than we were used to, but I was sort of prepared for an icy silence. And the thing that was nice for me was seeing how just different audiences respond differently, that they did respond to it, but they responded to different things in the play. And it seemed to me that a little obnoxious that they weren't giving them credit, as though New York audiences were somehow smarter and more gifted and more smug. Well, maybe they got different references, but it was an equally good audience. In fact, it was a great audience. Between Broadway and off-Broadway, I don't know. But I will say between our non-commercial run and our commercial run, there's a different expectation. You know, partly they're just paying more, so you feel sometimes they're crankier if it's not what they thought it was going to be. And
what do you attribute that to?
Money. And also what you said about dining out, that, you know, it's sort of a show me attitude. You know, here I am. Whereas if you sort of seek something out in the non-commercial circuit, it's partly just because you love going to the theater and you want to be surprised, not necessarily entertained or have something proven to you. Yeah.
It's helping, what we're doing is helping people to go that love the theater.
Yeah.
And that's the most important thing. We have more questions here. Would you please come up?
This to the panel. I'd like to know how often you attend the performance after it opens. You understand that?
David,
Want to start
Start at this side. You know, it's interesting. When I ran my theater downtown, Classic Stage Company, I would go periodically through the run of the show. In fact, I felt like a lot of really important work got done in front of an audience past the preview period. And I found it was a way of really honing and sharpening the play. I think it's important to give over the play to the actors and to trust them to do it the way it's been rehearsed, and to allow them to deepen it and change it in small ways. But I do think every now and then it's important to stop back and I would say maybe once a week or so at most, just to see that everything is still on track and that the stakes are high and that everything is as it should be.
I found that I go back. I have been working out of town quite a lot since my show opened, but I go back because the show is so complex, and at Jerry Zach's suggestion, actually, I put a new number in, a quiet number in the first act, and just to see how that flows and how it feels and how it's affected what's around it. I agree, though, that you can't go back and be a massive presence walking into the theater. You have to realize that there's been morphing and change, and dynamics have moved on, and that's a wonderful thing. But I think it's important to the actors also to know that you care about the production, and you come back and you still, it matters that things go well for them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I go about every 2 weeks.
Don't you have to read?
One more question.
Thanks. My name is Catherine Lilly, and I'm an actress, a dancer, and a little gymnastics sometimes. But I'd like to address Lynne Taylor-Corbett. Tell me about your transition from going from a dancer to a choreographer, and how difficult is this to achieve?
Well, for myself, I loved my dancing career very much. I always was looking around and sort of noticing other people and thinking, well, if only he had done that, or, as I've said before, I knew very early that my mind was not on myself as a performer as much as the creation around me, and, learning from the other directors and choreographers I was working with. I had a dance company called Theater Dance Collection that toured with the wonderful National Endowment when we used to have a National Endowment that
we
really supported arts. Yeah. Anyway, it meant a lot to my growth and the growth of a lot of other people that would not have otherwise had careers, I think. And that company nurtured 6 or 7 of us, actually. And so I was able to make a transition into doing commissions because of the profile of that company, and did, American Ballet Theater and some commissions, and then eventually was able to get into the commercial arena. And I think it's just a different path for everyone, but I think now we have videos, and everybody wants a video. We didn't have to do that when I was sort of coming up, but I just keep hoping for, that there are more arenas opening up for young choreographers, and Jacob's Pillow has one, DTW. Just keep hoping that there would be more places to experiment.
Thank you so much, Lynne. Thank you so much for being here. Once more, I have to interrupt you, and I just wish we could go on and on and on until certain time. Just listen to you people sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us, but unfortunately it has to end, and I have to say that this is the American Theater Wing Seminar on Working in the Theater, coming to you from the new Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And this seminar has been on the playwright, director, choreographer. And I can't tell you how important and how knowledgeable what they have had to say has been to all of us. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.